Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Daniel, and today in this video we'll be covering actually a chess.com training game I played this time. Alternative to the lead chess training games, I actually also play on chess.com. And so in this game I'm playing black. My rating at the time was 2136, and let's take a look at what happened in this critical moment. So my opponent here had just played the move queen takes on e5. So just to rewind a little bit. So here I played bishop to e5, trying to sort of mitigate my opponent from playing b5 by having some discovered ideas here. And my opponent, credit to him, finds a very nice tactic to win a pawn. However, here I had seen this variation, and here in this position, I'm actually pretty proud of this move. Here I play knight to b3. So knight to b3 on the surface isn't too difficult to find. It just forks sort of a lot of pieces, and I can win this pawn back in the future. But beyond knight to b3, I calculated that this rook actually has a really hard time to move. The best move here, in fact, is actually rook a2. And then from here, I can simply double up, and this pawn will be lost at some point. However, in the game, my opponent actually played the move rook to b1. Rook to b1 is the second best move because you have to move the rook anyway, so this is the second best square to go to. So here I play queen to d3. So actually here I actually end up trapping the rook. As you can see, the knight controls a1. My queen controls the square that the rook is currently on, which is b1, and there are no other squares that the rook can go to. My opponent here, credit to him, finds the correct sort of defensive idea by playing queen to e3. Queen c3, queen to g3 are both also other possibilities, pretty much going back to the third rank. The reason is because sort of you're x-ray attacking my knight, because if I take on b1, which I didn't actually do in the game, there is queen takes on b3. Although this is still better for black, there's no way to actually properly defend this b7 pawn, I realized. If I play a move like b6, then there's simply the move d3, which actually fully locks in my queen. As you can see, my queen actually has no way to get out, and it's probably going to get lost after the bishop moves. So I didn't really like this option. So I seen in this variation that this pawn will probably be lost because I need to get my queen out. Like let's say queen to g6. Then after queen takes on b7, then this pawn seems pretty weak, and white honestly seems to have a lot of pawns, and it looks actually decently playable for white, even though black is technically close to winning here. So instead here I play a different move, which is actually rook f to d8. So the idea with rook f to d8 is I noticed that this knight really clamps down on sort of, you'll see that the rook and the bishop are really clamped down here in this position. This rook has no squares to go to. This bishop's blocked in by both pawns, so this bishop can't get out. And my queen here obviously does a good job of blockading this pawn. And this knight here also attacks this pawn, so I can take it whenever I want, or take the bishop if necessary. So here my idea with rook f to d8 is that if my opponent takes, which they do in the game, then after rook takes on d3, you'll see that this sort of formation here, this formation is never getting out. All of these pieces are highlighted, technically including the a3 pawn once I play like a5, a4. And the only piece I can really move is this rook here. So I predicted that my opponent here would play like rook e1, and then after I double up to further put pressure here, my opponent would play rook to e3. And then if this would happen, my idea would be to sort of try to clamp in this rook on d3 by somehow putting a pawn on e4 and a pawn on f5. So for example, in a dream scenario, if I make random moves, if something like this were to happen, this is sort of the dream scenario I want. Because then my rook is really nicely supported by this pawn, and this pawn is obviously defended by this pawn, and maybe I can play like g6, for example, to complete this chain, and basically black's position is totally dominant. So that's the dream sort of scenario I was going for. However, after like something like rook to e3, I would have to play like king f8, king e7. It takes a little bit more time to try to get it, but I noticed that my opponent does have king f1, king e2, so although this is still better, it does take a little bit of effort, but I still went for this anyway. However, in the game actually, what my opponent actually played is rook to d1, which I didn't actually expect. Rook e1 makes a lot of sense, as I mentioned, to sort of try to trade off these rooks, and then maybe get the bishop active. However, rook to d1 doesn't really make too much sense. And then here I simply play rook a to d8, doubling up, putting even more pressure here. King to f1. And then here I play f5. My idea is e5 and then e4 to get the chain that I mentioned earlier. King to e2. Here I play e5. Here my opponent plays f3, and here I play king f7, just a slow improving move. I need to get my king out anyway. King e6, e4, those are both ideas, or king f6. Just have to bring the king in, bring another piece in a sense. h4, trying to play like g4, h5, something like that to get some counterplay. Here I just simply play g6 just to stop h5 at any point. Here my opponent plays g3, and here I play e4, clamping down on my opponent's position. And after we trade, I still get the structure here just without the f pawn, but this rook isn't on the rook isn't on the e file to actually attack this e4 pawn. So having this e4 pawn by itself is completely okay. Here my opponent plays king to f2, and here I play king to e6. What I should have done in this position is actually play the move e3 check. The idea here is that my opponent can't take this pawn because of this pin here, and I simply take this rook, and there's another pin here, and I should be able to win this piece. Alternatively, if you play like king e2, then I can simply take on d2, and you'll see that this bishop is actually trapped. There's nowhere for it to go, and I'm still attacking it. And if you play bishop takes d2, then I can simply trade, and you'll see I'm actually up a knight here. And white isn't even really up any pawns. In fact, white's only up one pawn, so black should be able to win this game. However, in the game, here I play king e6, my opponent plays g4, and here I actually do find the move e3, and then here it's kind of the same scenario. So after king e2, I simply take, the bishop's still trapped, and then after we trade everything, and then my opponent plays king e3, I just go after these two pawns, because these two pawns are the only menacing pawns, because here we do have like a 3-on-3 here on the queen side, and white has like a slight majority, so I just priority go for that first. My opponent plays king f3, and here I just sort of trade off both rooks. I do this with a fork, knight to d2 check, forking the king and the rook. I do lose my rook, but it's fine, I still have a knight. And here I just simply mop up some of these queenside pawns. The white's king isn't in a good position to actually defend them. So here I just simply clean these pawns up, put my knight on b6, and you'll see that my pawn and my knight coordinate really well and actually form a wall here. This knight also covers a4, and so pretty much there's a wall here, so white can't actually get in. White has to play all the way around, and even when you go all the way around, my king here protects all three of these squares, so pretty much white can't get in. And if you try to play a4 to try to dislodge my knight, I can simply play a5, and then there's no way to play a5 to dislodge my knight. So here after king c3, I just play king to e5, going after king f4, king takes, and king takes on h4. My opponent plays king to d3, king to f4. Keep in mind, my opponent still cannot get in. All of these squares are still protected by either my king, knight, or pawn. And so here I'm just simply threatening to take these pawns. Even if I lose this pawn, I still have this pass pawn here, so I'm completely okay. h5, my opponent tries to play h6, h7, h8. However, here I can simply take. There is no g5 trick because my king is already here to take. And if you take on h5, then I simply have king to g5 to hunt down this pawn. If you play h6, which is what happened in the game, I can simply take on h6, and in this position, my opponent actually resigned the game. So in general, a very nice positional game, a positional conversion, pretty much starting from back here, with this idea to not take this rook, not take the free material, but instead clamping down on my opponent's position so that my opponent's pieces cannot get out. And you'll see that later on this paid off really nicely. I got this really nice outposted rook, and in the end I managed to play e3 to break through and liquidate the position into a winning position for me as I was up a piece. So once again, very smooth positional game, and yeah, hope you all enjoyed. Thanks for watching.